Okay, shall we kick off? We've got a good group here already, and I imagine we'll get a few more colleagues joining us. So it's quite exciting that you've all been able to join us for this session. It's another one of the tipping points discussions that look at the interface between conservation and development. My name is Frank Vorhies, and I'm going to facilitate the session today. And we're talking today about wildlife meat, wild meat, and cultured or lab meat, and the interface between these two product lines and conservation, rewilding landscapes, conserving wildlife, etc. So looking at the potential benefits and risks of both approaches, promoting a wild meat industry and promoting a cultured meat industry, with in the background the livestock industry, of course. And how do these provide alternatives to, or additions to, or replacements to, if you will, the livestock sector? And there's, of course, environmental, social, and economic dimensions of this discussion. Okay, we're being recorded, and the recording will be available on the YouTube channel of the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation Group, or GRC. And so, as I said earlier to the folks that came on right on time, if you've just come on, do please introduce yourself in the chat box so you can share who you are with the other folks that have joined it. My quick introduction about me, you can tell by the accent I'm an American. I'm a sort of wannabe African. My wife is from the Cape, and I'm currently the director of the African Wildlife Economy Institute, which is here at Stellenbosch University in the Cape. And I also have a position as a research visitor in the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at the University of Oxford, up in that cold, wet island off Europe, if you know where it is, somewhere near France. And my big interest these days, which connects up to the topic of the day, is on standards and certification schemes for wildlife enterprise. How do we assure stakeholders that the products are being produced responsibly in environmental and social terms? So we've got three panelists with us, and I'll give you a quick introduction to them, and then I'm going to ask each of them to do an introduction to the topic. You'll see that in a minute. And then we've got a couple questions to kick off the discussion, but of course, please put some questions in the chat box, and the Q&A session will then be after the presentations, and we can get stuck into some responses and back and forth with your inputs and views on this topic. Also, to stay up to date on these webinars, this is not a standalone webinar, it's part of a fantastic series that OGRC is putting on. You can sign up to the OGRC newsletter, and you can also follow OGRC on social media channels. So quite a lot of you obviously are doing that because you have found this place, but do share with your colleagues and friends, because it's great to get folks involved in these talks. They're a wonderful opportunity. So we've got three speakers, and in the order they'll be giving their opening remarks. We have Paul, Wiseman, and Letitia. Paul's a qualified vet and also a zoologist, and he's been in this conservation game for many years. He started a biobank quite a few years ago with Endangered Wildlife Trust, that's now with Sandby. He's also worked on wildlife management and cell culture biobanking. He's received awards such as the Mazda Wildlife Fund Conservation Award of the Decade, Conservationist of the Decade Award. And now he's got a wild cultivated meat company. So he's actually serious about his topic. It's not this theoretical, he's doing it. He's established a not-for-profit company called Meat Our Future, MEAT, Our Future, where he's developing the scientific ecosystem for developing cultivated meat as a source of animal protein. So we're going to kick off with him in a minute, because it's the techie part to start with, and then we'll bring it back to Wiseman in the bush with wild meat, and then Letitia coming out of the government is going to say, how do we manage all these innovations in our landscape? So Wise is a PhD from Venda. He's with us at Stellenbosch as a postdoc, working on wild meat, actually developing Always Whole Wild Meat program, looking at the value chains for wild meat from across Africa savannas, from KZN and if you all the way up to Libya, across the whole savanna of the continent. He's a professional business coach, writer, facilitator. He's real into the business side of this whole conservation thing. And as I mentioned, he has his degrees from the University of Venda in rural development and agri-economics. Letitia is with DFFE, She's the director of the Wildlife Economy Program, so she has a wonderful task of looking at all these innovations and figuring out the role that the government can play to either support them or make sure they stay on track and go in the right direction. And she's a pro at this. She's been 15 years working on biodiversity and conservation, working on policy, strategy, guidelines, you name it. And she's very much engaged with the international agenda on conservation and sustainable use, CBD, CITES, and so on. So she brings the real policy framework to our discussion. So enough about who they are. Let's hear what they have to say. So as I said, we'll go from Paul to Wiseman to Letitia in that order. Paul, I think start off with you, and then after a minute or two, you might pop up a couple slides to help explain what this whole cultured meat topic is all about. Paul.
Thank you very much, Frank. And yeah, thanks everyone. Yes, so I think we're all very aware of climate change and what is happening. And especially if we start looking around now, what's happening in Greece and Portugal and in America, we can actually see this. But when we talk about other effects, such as biodiversity loss and wildlife loss, we have these other drivers as well. And part of that, of course, is livestock production. So we know that the livestock production produces more than 14% of all greenhouse gases, also uses a heck of a lot of water, and of course it uses a lot of land. And so here lies a problem with land use. So we know the human population is growing. We all like to eat meat. Yes, we have more vegans and more vegetarians, but in actual fact, there's a lot more meat eaters now going forward. And one of the problems is, if we're going to address this, what are we going to do? If we look at intensive livestock production, in other words, production that happens in feedlots, so-called factory farming, and we see the amount of land that needs to be used. And why do we have intensive livestock production? Well, we have it because economically it's better, because you don't have to grow the animal for as long on the veld. They get put into a feedlot. They get a high energy diet, and they put on a lot of weight. And so from a market point of view, that's really valuable. But as we know in South Africa, we also have a lot of marginal land. And we have a trend that is starting now also around the world called regenerative agriculture or livestock production, where animals are left on the land for longer. But we know from an economic point of view, if you really want to get the cheapest meat into the market, it's not always that practical. But we do have this land, and of course we have game farms, and of course they make use of this land very, very effectively and efficiently. But if we look at our arable land, if we are going to increase production, we're going to have to plow more land. 40% of all the maize that's planted in South Africa goes to feeding cattle in feedlots. So that's a huge demand on more land that's going to happen over the next decade or two, because we know our population in Africa is going to double in the next 30 years. So it's a heck of an issue as far as this driver. So yes, we all look at climate change, and there's some massive changes happening with fossil fuels, etc. But what's happening? What else are we doing? What else is driving this? And we know that that's also being driven by agriculture. But we need to eat, and people want to eat meat. So how do we address this? How do we get more meat to people without having to plow up more land? Because we know our tourism industry makes use of both game farming, wildlife ranching, as well as tourism to our national parks, nature reserves, etc. But as we have more people and as we have more agriculture, this is putting huge, tremendous pressure on this. And of course, that's a massive impact on our biodiversity as well. And of course, we know biodiversity is one of the best ways of mitigating against climate change going forward. So along came Mark Post in 2013, and he produced the first hamburger patty in the lab. And of course, a lot of people say, my goodness, what is this? How is this? Is it really meat? We know we have vegetarian alternative meats, but that's processed plant material. But here we have now actual animal cells. So in one's body and in the muscles of animals, we have stem cells. And so as one exercises, or as the animal is growing up, these stem cells are multiplying, and this becomes a resource. And so I'll go through a few slides. And what's happened in the last couple of years is that companies have jumped onto this. a lot quicker than academia has. And there's about 160 companies now, and there's now 2 places in the world where you can actually eat cultivated meat, more specifically chicken at this time. But if I can share my slides quickly, I'll run through them very quickly. Just need to find the place where it says share. So I just need to make this bigger. So if you could see my slides, yes, as we mentioned, there's a company that we formed as well as an NGO. We've just rebranded from Mogale Meat Company to Wild Buyer. But basically, it's cultivating a wild future for us, because as I mentioned, with intensive livestock production in feedlots, in factory farms, we use a huge amount of land. 14%, all the greenhouse gases, more than all the transport in the world put together, and more than a ton of water used to produce a kilo of meat. So taking a small sample, growing up these stem cells, it's basically turns out to be the same meat. In other words, it's not affecting the wildlife out there. Normal wildlife game ranching can continue as such, but we can produce more meat to be able to feed a growing population. So of course, this needs cell banks, collecting cell cultures from different sources. We were fortunate, we were in the X Prize Feed the Next Billion semi-finalist. We've also produced the first chicken nuggets, but we're also working now on wildlife, taking it up from a cell bank to benchline cell production, and then providing a diversity of these cells to the growing cultivated meat industry. So we look at the market, we know the meat market is massive, so too is the venison market. So how can one get to a point where we are actually helping to grow this market? So this is not alternative, in other words, get rid of the one and do the other. This is supplementing going forward. Sorry, I didn't want to show you that slide, but basically this can be done. Samples can be collected, samples can be transported, tiny little samples, 2 ml tubes, to facilities like this to be able to grow meat. So yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity, and over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Paul. That's fabulous. It's really, really fascinating, really interesting. I'm now thinking about whether you're going to make biltong out of it, or I'll hold my questions until we get to it. Wiseman, your thoughts on this comment? Now we've been in the lab. Can we get back to the field for a few minutes and hear from you, Wise?
Thank you very much, Francis, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be part of this conversation where we talk about how we can rewild, how we can restore landscapes by using alternative meat. The major question that we ask ourselves is, can we really consume wild meat and use it as a vehicle actually to transform and also restore wild landscapes? Is this the real question that we should be asking? Can we transform, can we restore landscapes using or relying on the consumption of wild meat? So we ask this question because we're looking at the growing population and the demand for protein. We ask this question so that we try to find the balance between how we can restore landscapes, at the same time make sure that we continue to have enough biodiversity in terms of our wildlife species, not only wildlife species in terms of meat, but also plants. So can the meat consumption or wild meat consumption be the option for us moving forward in terms of providing protein for everyone as a source to rewild and also to restore landscapes? So one of the reasons why we ask this question is because we have found that current practices in the conservation sector are mainly focusing on the protection and stopping the use of wild meat species. So we are actually bringing a different understanding or thinking of saying, can the wild meat be a tool for rewilding? Can wild meat be a vehicle for channeling or for championing restoration of landscapes? So the current systems or the current interventions that are used in the conservation practice and policy are all about the reducing the demand for wild meat. So are these the right methodologies in which we can restore landscapes? So these questions have been ongoing for a very long time. But however, we find that in the practice, people still continue to demand the protein from wild meat. The wild meat sector has grown in the last few years significantly, driven by the growing population and also the need for healthier options. For example, organic meat, which is mainly found, or which is mainly provided by the wild species or the wild meat species. So this is the question, this is the direction in which we are trying to look into, to say, if we focus on consumption of wild meat, then can the landscapes be restored? So the restoration of landscapes cannot be detached from the consumption of wild meat, because if we are saying let's reduce the demand for protein from wild meat and continue to focus on the meat protein alternatives that are coming from plants or coming from chicken, cattle, goats, sheep, is this the right way in which we can coexist with our nature and still benefit from it without really destroying the landscapes? But we see that if we say let's move people in the direction of consuming the cattle and alternative meat, protein alternatives, such as you can talk of beans and other crops that provide protein. But we see the clearing and the clearing of many rangelands so that we can open spaces for consumption, for growing and cultivating these different types of crops that provide us with protein. But is this the right way in which we can coexist with our nature? Is this the right way in which we can provide a protein for the people and at the same time maintain the integrity of the landscapes? So this is the reason why we are saying, if we are to focus on the consumption of wild meat, there is an opportunity for us to continue to benefit from nature and also at the same time continue to benefit from nature in terms of protein, and also continue to restore landscapes and see the cultivation of agricultural products at the same time having landscapes being restored using the conservation policy that at least allows the coexistence of the two. So if we don't have policies that promote the existence of wild meat, we run a risk of destroying our landscapes by clearing more land, trying to cultivate more crops, and also trying to grow, open more landscapes for cattle ranching, for growing our sheep and cows. So if we can harness that and understand these different protein alternatives, we have an opportunity for ourselves to start to say, let's reintroduce wild meat species and also consume and benefit from them by not removing them or stopping the use. Because in the past, all these methodologies that, or policies in conservation of trying to stop the conservation, the consumption of wild meat species, we have seen people jumping in fences, coming into the parks or coming into the conserved areas and putting on snares, poisoning animals, and also in order to get these animals, or to get the protein that is provided by the wild meat species. So is this the right methodology? Because at the same time, when people are jumping in fences, poisoning, putting in snares to access the protein that is provided by wild meat species, they tend to kill also other animals that are not intended to be killed in the process. And there's no one actually monitoring what is actually happening in the areas or in the conserved areas where these wild meat species exist. So this is the problem that we are currently facing as at a global level, in which we are saying, is the policy, is the current practice in conservation the right way? Is it currently structured the right way, in where we saying let's stop the use or let's prohibit the utilization of wild meat species? We are saying it is actually better to promote the utilization, or to look at the utilization of wild meat species by coexisting and also building sustainable systems in which we can harvest and benefit from these wild meat species by monitoring how they are harvested, how they are used, as opposed to clearing all the landscapes so that we can find this alternative protein that is provided by cows, cattle, goats, and plants as well. So this is the debate that we are having, and we are saying, how can we then, moving forward, build a case for ourselves in balancing the nature conservation, at the same time balancing the demand for protein, that protein for us as humans from the nature that we live with. So it is not an ideal position or situation where we can only focus on clearing land, opening more, clearing land, causing deforestation, and also opening the land for degradation by plowing more crops. So actually, if we are focusing more on clearing land, we are actually being anti-ecosystems. Are we really going to have a sustainable future where the landscapes are restored and transformed, and also at the same time the humans are benefiting? As Paul has indicated previously, that the population is growing, so the demand for protein is going to grow. If we are to make sure we meet the demand of the future, is it the right way to continue to clear more land and more land for all these, to meet the demand for protein by humans? But if we can instill or retain sustainability in the sector, we have an opportunity to rewild, restore our landscapes at the same time, and benefit from the nature, and also provide the protein that is needed in the sector. Thank you. We'll discuss more as we go forward. Thanks.
Fabulous, Wiseman. Thanks, Wise. Thanks, Paul, for setting up two very interesting approaches to new ways to scale up the food security and protein from wild animals, either through lab cultured meat or through actually rewilding landscapes and increasing wildlife populations. So what's the government going to do about this? And not an official perspective, of course, but we have lucky to have Letitia here to be able to say, what's some thoughts you have looking at this from a policy framework? Wiseman talked about policy from a technical scientific framework that Paul discussed. So over to you, Letitia, for your opening remarks about these two interesting approaches.
Thank you.
You're on, you're live.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much. Francis, please confirm if I'm audible.
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this interesting topic about rewilding of the landscape through the wildlife program. My name is introduced, I'm Letitia from the National Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, and I'm sitting within the branch responsible for biodiversity and conservation. So I would really like to indicate that as a country, we've actually achieved more in terms of working towards the conservation outcomes. And now our focus is mainly on how to manage the sustainable use of our biodiversity. And how are we doing that? I think this whole journey started in 2015 when we introduced what we call a national biodiversity economy strategy, which was mainly focused on promoting the sustainable use of our biodiversity. But for the purpose of this session, we are going to be, we are focusing on the promotion of the game meat, as well as the wildlife ranching, or one could call it the game farming. Indeed, as the department, we are promoting this game farming and the wildlife ranching, as well as all the products that are derived from our wildlife species, such as the game meat. And we are doing that through what we call a national game meat strategy, which is at its final stages. And as I've already indicated, this is done as part of the efforts to implement what we call the Biodiversity Operation Pakisa. This is the program that we went into in 2016 with all our stakeholders ranging from government, industry, communities, academia, and you name them. And we went through a very extensive planning process where we really wanted to come out with a clear intervention on how to promote these economic activities that are derived from the biodiversity in general. And we're looking at three sectors: the wildlife economy, the bioprospecting economy, as well as the ecotourism economy. But I'm going to be focusing mainly on the wildlife economy because that is where the game meat aspect is coming from. Just to give you a little bit of what our game meat strategy is all about. So it seeks to create an enabling environment for a formalized and transformed game meat industry in South Africa that supports the thriving rural economies while contributing to food security and socio-economic growth, and ensuring sustainable use of wildlife resources, biodiversity conservation, whilst reducing environmental risk. And you can see that in our objective, we are not running away from the conservation objective as much as the promotion is more on the sustainable use. We still want to achieve the conservation outcomes in our intervention. So there's a lot that is really happening within the sector. And we know that with the game meat strategy, there's quite a number of initiatives that needs to actually complement the whole process that we want to work on. And you will realize that the game meat production value chain itself is start at the level of the game farm or the wildlife ranch, which exists anywhere else other than on land. So in other words, with the strategy that we are promoting, we need to also consider issues of access to land for this kind of intervention to actually materialize. And what is really notable from the research that has been undertaken in the sector, it is recorded that in the 50s and back there in the 50s, I think we had about 500 animals available in the country. And currently the studies are revealing that we are now sitting on over 20 million wild animal species. So you can see that there's quite a lot of species that are going to be helping us to promote this strategy whenever it becomes ready for implementation. However, as I've indicated that there are issues of land in the space, but what is really interesting for us is that some of the land that is needed for this are still under issues of restitution, and we know the process that is being undertaken. But what is really important is the fact that not all land that has potential to contribute to the objective of this game meat strategy is under the land and agrarian reform. And again, as we're putting our effort towards implementing this strategy, we then benefit more on the cooperative governance that opens door for collaboration and cooperation among government departments through instruments such as the Memorandum of Understanding, where we see our department entering into what we call the Memorandum of Understanding with the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, which allows us to obtain frequent update on progress regarding the settlement status of landscape, land claim, especially on those relating to the biodiversity conservation. And to date, the report that has been shared with us is really acceptable to support the game meat strategy. And again, with the strategy being also focused largely on issues of transformation and expanding the rural livelihood, as I've already shared through the vision that I've shared with you of our game strategy, we see that in our strategy, we are going to be able to get our communities that were actually excluded through the previous regime coming into the space and then able to participate in the sector. And that is clearly provided within the strategy through the goals that are provided in the strategy. We have quite a number of goals in the game meat strategy that focuses on transformation in a form of increasing the number of thriving, previously disadvantaged individuals, women and youth, as wildlife managers and other game meat value chain actors from the current less than 4% to about more than 25% by 2013. This is our commitment through our national game meat strategy. And we wish to see the growth in terms of job opportunities in the game meat sector by 10% per annum by 2030. And again, we would like to shift from an informal byproduct of hunting. So there is a belief that you can only get meat after there has been a trophy hunting initiative or activity in the ranch, but we would really want to promote a commercial meat production, processing and marketing industry. And for us to really work through that commitment, we'd like to see an increase in terms of the enterprise development with a more than 30 large production enterprises, more than 5 large harvesting enterprises, as well as more than 10 large processing enterprises by 2030. And again, I spoke about the issues of land as one of the critical aspects for this strategy to be successful. We'd like to bring 1 million hectares of community-owned land into game meat production with associated localized value chain. We have ideas of how much of the game meat that is produced in the country gets exported and how much remains in the country and who are the players in the sector. So that is why now we have this commitment to get our previously disadvantaged group to also participate in the game meat production or game meat industry. And I would like to also say that the overall successful implementation of this strategy will actually enhance rural livelihood. I think Wiseman has really touched a lot on this aspect. And by doing so, we see this strategy keeping the poverty and unemployment situation that we are currently challenged with in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all that information about what an amazing program you're undertaking. We had some Eventbrite questions that came beforehand, and to be fair to the people that do that, we could go through them, but we've had so many questions coming in the chat. It's just amazing. I think we might even think about coming out with a Q&A after this talk, after this tipping point talk, and try and answer all of them. We won't get them done in the next 20 minutes, that's for sure. But I'll just touch on one of the Eventbrite questions. Paul, I think you've already been alluding to this in the chat box. Your presentation focused on livestock, which makes sense, and this is a new approach that provides an alternative to livestock meat and has the implication that it will take the livestock pressure off the landscape. But how do you address the cultured meat vis-a-vis the case that's being put forward by both Wiseman and Letitia for a wild meat industry in the country? Do you see your cultured meat product as a threat to a wild meat industry and to the conservation outcomes of a wild meat industry, or do you see it as a potential opportunity? So maybe let's, out of the chat, to say a couple words on how you see the cultured wild meat vis-a-vis wild meat, I guess you'd say.
Thanks. I think it's a massive opportunity because, again, it supports the wildlife industry, and in the sense that we will be able to produce more meat for a growing population, and that's very important, without impacting the land, and that's the big issue. So by not impacting the land, you're supporting biodiversity and wildlife, be it tourism, be it culling for meat production, be it all those aspects that are still there with be it nature conservation and be it wildlife ranching, and supporting rewilding, because again, I think rewilding is absolutely critical going forward. So there's and why do tourists come to Africa? Or one of the big reasons, shall we say, why tourists come to Africa is for its wildlife. So this is definitely not to replace both nature conservation or wildlife ranching. It's there to support it, and it's there to open up the markets. You must remember that when you produce some of this meat, for instance, we lost our fresh meat export in 2010, I think it was, because of the outbreak of foot and mouth disease. And certainly with cultivated meat, you're brewing these cells as if it's in a beer brewery type situation. Sterile conditions where regulatory people can look at it and say, hey, there's no chance of transmitting diseases, and therefore reopen the fresh meat market, let's say, to Europe. So there's a lot of advantages to support current production, both be it game ranches or nature conservation.
Okay, fabulous. Really, really interesting. There was also a question about the whole game meat, wild meat strategy vis-a-vis land transformation and re-empowerment. I think Letitia laid out a very exciting vision of what the department, DFFE, is working on with the game meat strategy and inclusion and empowerment. So we don't have to go through that one. There's a question that should go to Paul, but let me see. What we've got is the Jive team is putting some of the questions together for me, which are really great. By the way, shout out to Jive. They're doing an amazing job with these series. This is a type of question we can't answer here, but just to put it out, this is the type of information we will need going forward. Anya asked whether the microbiological load and safety comparisons of lab-grown meat versus natural game meat. So how do these things compare up technically? And we need to get the agri-science folks to look at that. So Paul, I won't go into that now, or Wiseman, because I think it's a big topic, but it is an important question that we need to ask for sure. But one of the questions we could sit here from Colin is about what if we start a game meat industry, a wild game meat industry, and we can ask Wiseman, and I think this is one of the things that Paul was just alluding to. One of the risks of the gaming industry is that it may turn into a game farming industry and not wild harvesting, and we just end up with a landscape that instead of cattle, we're running kudu like cattle, and so we transform natural landscapes into intensive meat production landscapes, but with different animals. So we haven't really got the conservation. So Wise, how do we keep landscapes open if we want to actually increase the production of kudu, wildebeest, and so on to provide meat without it turning into a feedlot type program like we have with livestock?
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for the question. I think when we address this question, we need to start thinking about the conservation itself, and also using the wildlife economies, which is in this case the production or the consumption of wild meat as an economy or as a tool for conservation. So when we agree that this wildlife economy, it can be used as a conservation tool, then we need to agree on development of standards and practices which can then be adopted and enforced on how we can consume and use the wildlife sustainably. That is, in these certifications, we are not looking to say, we are looking to say, how can people harvest ethically without having to use medicine and start to farm and treat wild animals the same way as we are treating cows, goats, and other protein alternatives from agriculture. So we have to build proper systems and certifications for sustainable use of our wild meat species, so that we don't end up reversing the wheel and converting the wild sector into agriculture.
Okay, so in other words, it's not wild meat on its own, it's wild meat within a framework of standards, certifications, regulatory framework to align it. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And Lisanne asked a similar question that I'll give this one over to Paul about, if you will, the standards for the cultivated meat sector. So she asks, under what environmental, biodiversity, agriculture is this stuff allowed? Is there a legal framework for it? Do we not need a social and environmental impact assessment? How do we determine the risks and opportunity of the wild meat? Or even thinking about Paul Letitia's overview of the country's game meat strategy, is there also a need for a national cultured meat strategy?
Very, very good question. And yeah, time for a whole webinar on that. But very briefly, just to put everyone in the picture from a global perspective, there's only 2 countries in the world at the moment that has regulations for producing and eating cultivated meat. Singapore was the first country in 2020, and the reason was because of their food security. Just as an example, when the Ukraine-Russia war broke out, the Malaysians stopped all export of chicken to Singapore. That's 190 million chickens a week. So you can see they're quite concerned about food security. What is great is that in the last 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, America has now got regulations for cultivated meat. So yes, in South Africa, we do not have it. We will have to work on it. At the same time, I want to say that this is a work in progress. So yes, there are 2 places in the world where you can go and eat cultivated meat, but in very small quantities. So there's a lot of research that still has to take place, and that's we're busy with it here. And there's about 160 companies around the world that is working on it, including Israel, the Netherlands, the US, Brazil, etc. So it's a work in progress. It's going to take at least 5 or 6 years before you can say, hey, I want to go to a restaurant in South Africa. Because first of all, you've got to get those regulations right. And number 2, you've got to get the process right. So it's, again, if you want to visualize it, it's like a massive brewery. These massive stainless steel tanks, all very sterile, no contaminations allowed. If there is a contamination, that lot gets pushed away. So again, it's going to take a while. But yeah, very good question. But you've got to start somewhere. It's like the electric car industry. The first electric cars were in 1932 or 22. but it's really only in the last 2 decades that electric cars have really taken off. You had to wait for battery technology to really develop. That was one of the things holding it back. So there's a few things holding this back, because we cannot convert every bioreactor, let's say the brewery bioreactors in the world, besides the fact that a lot of people will toy because they'll still want their breweries. But if you had to convert all of them to cultivated meat, you'd still only produce enough meat for 1.5% of the world population. So yeah, this is still a work in progress.
Okay. Okay, excellent. Letitia, there's a couple strong questions, comments, questions from the consumer side of things. And let me read one from Reinhold, because I think there are a lot of people out in our different communities that have the same feeling that Reinhold has. And he says, I'm waiting to hear a strong, passionate voice that gives a firm message about activities that will stop the massacre of wild animals through poaching, particularly when the reason given for this cruel, inhumane activity is that it's done under the pretense of providing food. So both Paul and Wiseman, Letitia, are talking about processes that are wrapped around protein and food provision. But there's a large community of people out there in South Africa and around the world that are very concerned about the harvesting of wild animals for protein. They think it's actually wrong and so on. Does the game meat strategy that you guys are working on, that the department's working on, address this type of stakeholder consumer demand? Or how do we address it? How do we address the passionate voice for non-use of wildlife, at the same time promote a wildlife economy?
Thank you very much for the question, and I fully understand the question. I think this is something that we've had quite a number of time during our consultation process towards the National Game Meat Strategy. Indeed, the issues of poaching and the manner in which the harvesting take place is something that some respective groups see it as a matter of concern. But basically what we are trying to do as a government, we are reaffirming the culture that existed before the introduction of any policy instrument in the country. We know that we are recovering from a very painful situation where our traditional hunter-gatherers were labeled as poachers overnight through the introduction of some of the legislation that could not take into consideration the cultural aspect of our local communities who have lived for many years with these natural resources. And interesting, you know, many Africans, they even have totems that actually assist in terms of protecting some of the keystone species. And as the South African tradition, I think it's not everything that goes to our plate. So there are species that are targeted for food security, and our strategy is very much clear in terms of the model that we are going to apply in terms of promoting the game meat strategy. As we are speaking currently, meat is being consumed, and we are monitoring the trends, and we know that there are those that are really not that are having certain issues with how the meat is being consumed, and we are actually giving them a listening ear. I think as government, we've actually established a process. There's a forum that has been established that is looking at the wildlife well-being aspect. I think a lot is going to unfold in that forum, but as we are a government that is servicing the whole country, I think where there's a need, I think we need to also deal with, respond to the needs of our communities. And I think once we get the outcome from the other process, I think we'll be able to have clear way forward on some of these aspects. But as where we are sitting, I think the promotion of the game meat is not like we are disconnecting ourselves from the regulatory environment. We are just making it possible for those that are in the sector to be able to operate and enjoy this lean and healthy protein that come from our own. I was in Europe some few weeks ago, and I saw how they are very much strong in promoting the history of the area, the museums and everything. So as a country, we also have our history in the meat consumption from our own indigenous animal species that we can show the world. Thank you.
Okay, fascinating. That's really interesting. It is a very complex thing with the different preferences. There's a couple more questions on this, and I want to put the next one to Wise, if I can. And following on from that, Abisha asks a question about what role consumer preferences and public awareness plays, and this even gets to lobbying the government to be pro or against something, and the UK hunting trophy prohibition bill is brought up as an example. But following on from what Letitia said, consumer preferences, and then Paul, I'll come back to you next too, is there a demand for wild meat, Wiseman? I mean, do people really want it? Letitia says it's actually in the cultures in Africa, so there's a big demand. I know it's in my interest. I always tell people I come to Africa to count how many animals I've eaten, not how many I've taken pictures of, but that's me. So is there a demand for it? And then I'm going to ask Paul after you sort of the same question, but then with Paul, we'll ask about, is there enough demand to make this financially feasible? But first, Wiseman, looking at the value chains, if it's great, what if we produce all this stuff, but nobody wants to eat it? Where do you see it? Do you see is there a market for wild meat?
Thank you, Frank, for the question. Yes, maybe to answer this question, the first thing we have to look into is why is there poaching for wild meat species in the protected areas or even in some of the private game reserves? The main reason for poaching is because people are looking for these alternative, I mean, they are looking for the protein that comes from wild meat species. So it's an indicator for demand. And also, if we check the statistics, for example, if you look in Congo, the demand for wild meat has increased by, it's almost the consumption of wild meat is about 30% in Congo. So this indicates that there is a demand in the market, and also working with abattoirs generally in the here in South Africa, they sometimes run out of where to get the wild meat species where they can slaughter and supply into the market. So generally, there is a demand for wild meat, and a lot of people are going into the protected areas and game reserves to poach so that they can access this meat. So if we can build proper value chains and get the meat to the market, people will consume the meat. And certainly, I confirm that there is demand. Yes, it needs to be monitored, it needs to be measured so that we at least can take a proper stock of how much is demanded and who is demanding it and where. Thank you.
I know that there's an initiative up in Zambia where the stakeholders are talking about how to build the wild meat market, because there's demand to actually replace the illegal meat market, get a legal meat market going, get the value chains right, get the transparency and so on. So, okay, so your view, there is a demand. Now, Paul, demand for cultured meat. I'm not sure I'm there yet, but you can convince me. Technically, it sounds fine, but if there isn't a demand, we can then tie that to Sanat's question: is it going to be financially feasible? So how can will you be able to develop a market for this product that's going to be able to make the market, the production a profitable enterprise?
Absolutely, good question. And if we again look at the history, when Mark Post first showed this first hamburger in 2013, it was, he estimated the cost of the hamburger was $230,000 US. Now, yes, nobody's going to pay that for a hamburger. But I can say that the price has come down tremendously, remembering that the media that these cells grow in is pharma grade, in pharmacology grade, but there's now a much cheaper production systems. If you look at the first sequencing of the human genome, it cost over $3 trillion US. Today, for $1,000, you can get your own genome sequenced. So as this catches on and grows, so the price will come down. The aim is to get it to price parity of local meat. And this first started more from the vegan side. So a lot of the companies that started cultivated meat, their reason was to stop all slaughtering of animals. But we've seen that it's grown. And if you look at some of the more recent companies, again, we know that, and more specifically in our own context here in Africa, we know even in South Africa, we've got this, so we say, the two different poles, no animals should be harmed at all versus, consumption. And obviously Africa is still, and South Africa is still on that, in that area. We've got to look after the people. They come first, they need to eat. They need good nutrition. They need essential amino acids from animal products. And so this is going to go on. Who's to say maybe in 100 years' time or 150 years' time that there might not be slaughtering of animals? I don't know, but that's not the point now. The point is that consumers are looking at this, and this is an alternative. So you have a choice. I don't see a lot of people eating just cultivated meat in the next few decades. But the point is, there's an alternative to play a role that can help the planet, the environment, wildlife, and biodiversity. Because remember, we said right in the beginning, it's not just your fossil fuels, it's also the way we produce our beef, the way we, in order to bring the price down, we grow them in factory farms. And that has got a massive impact on the land. And so that's why it is. And we find that people, as soon as they start understanding, as soon as you explain some of these situations, that a lot more people, especially the younger generation, they are much more, with some of the surveys that have been done, they're much more excited about the fact that there are these alternatives going forward, and that they can then make their own choice.
Great, thanks, Paul. We've run out of time. I think both Paul and Wiseman have made the case that there's consumers for their products, and so there may be public interest and support for both. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Wiseman and Letitia. Thank you very much for laying out where the government's moving in this space. It's very, very exciting. The questions were amazing. I wish we had more time to go through them, but they were, I think just reading the questions, you folks, while we've had the discussion, tells you that both of these approaches are really, really interesting. The next tipping point is on the 31st of August. There's been a link shared in the chat box, and it's on Africa's grassy biomes. We'll have a panel with Professor William Bond, Dr. Heidi Hawkins, Dr. Duncan Camillo, and Dr. Susie Vetter is going to be facilitating it. So it should be great. You can sign up for that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a newsletter that OGRC has out that you should sign up as well. So once again, Paul, Wiseman, Letitia, fabulous 1 hour. I wish we had 2 and 3 hours more to go, but we don't. So thank you very much. And thanks everybody for joining this session. See you at the next one.